Hello, 7th grade. It is Mr. Frazier. Today is Wednesday, April 15th. This is your history lecture. Today we are going to talk about the Civil War. I hope you guys are all doing well. I've graded all your papers, your report cards are going out. I have updated iGrade Plus. I'm not going to send back every graded paper because that's just too much trouble. But I posted everything on iGrade Plus so you can see what your grades are on everything. If you have a specific question about a specific assignment, just email me, let me know. But today we got a lot to get to, so we're going to dive right in. I may make this video into 2 parts, just so you don't have to listen to 30 minutes of me blab on. But the Civil War is a big deal, and it's very complicated. And your book doesn't give us much to work with. So when we were last together virtually, we were talking about the war breaking out. Remember, the Civil War is about slavery. The southern states want to say it's our right to do this or that or the other, but it was basically their right to own slaves and to leave the Union because they felt that slavery was threatened. So soon as Abraham Lincoln is elected in 1860, you have South Carolina and a couple other states that immediately secede. Later, Virginia and some other states will join them, but the Confederate States, they're fighting for slavery. However, they want to make flowery terms about it. They weren't upset about, economic, agrarian policies. It was slavery, plain and simple. Now, we talked about in past chapters how the South had built their economy basically on cotton. And that's going to come in huge for the Civil War. Remember when we were talking about how each colony was established? In the North, they didn't have the soil or the geography for huge plantations. So the northern states developed industry, factories, fishing, boats, trade. The South was dependent on trading cotton for everything, pretty much. So when the war breaks out, the Union can, manufacture rifles. They can build boats. They can build cannons and bullets and all of the things you need for a war. The South can't do any of that. So they have to trade. So they're trading with England and France primarily. They're trading cotton for, guns. They're trading cotton for bullets. They're trading cotton for cannons. They can't really make much of their own. Now, during the war, the South is doing better than the North when it comes to leadership. So the generals, General Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson and Beauregard, are much better than the Union generals. And Lincoln, we will see, goes through a bunch of generals. He ends up with Grant, but he starts with Burnside and McClellan and Meade and all these other generals who just get, even though they have more guys, they have more troops, they have better weapons, they're better supplied, they just get outmaneuvered and defeated every single time. But the North has more manpower, it has more industry, it can build more things, more railroads, more guns, more all of the things, and it has a much better navy. So the 2 strategies for the Civil War, the South has this idea that they're going to use their better leadership and they feel better troops, and they're going to invade and beat up the Union Army, and the Union Army will just give up. The Union comes up with this idea of starving out the South, and that's what we're going to talk about to begin today. The blockade. The South has pretty much no navy to speak of. The North not only has a much better navy, but it's a more modern navy. And so, if you think of the eastern United States, the Union is going to try to block off all trade with the South. So when the South tries to send its ships to England to trade cotton for guns, the Union ships just blow them up and sink them. And the idea that is that the blockade will starve the South. They won't be able to get guns, they won't be able to get food, they won't be able to get all of these things, and they'll eventually just give up. So that's what a blockade is. Many countries do this throughout different wars. In World War I and II, England tries to set up a blockade around Germany and basically just starve them out. It's kind of like laying siege to a whole country. So the Union controls all of the Gulf of Mexico and all of the Atlantic Ocean, and so the South knows that they have limited time because of this blockade. Now they try a couple things. Sometimes they try building some fast ships that can just like outrun the Union blockade. But even if you do that a couple times, that's not enough to feed the entire southern United States. So they try to steal a metal ship. Now the North had already built what were called like Ironsides. All ships up to this point, if you think of like Pirates of the Caribbean, the ships are made of wood. Now wood floats and it's light, and so sailing with wooden ships is very awesome. But there's a problem because if you're in a fight, you can shoot a cannonball through wooden ships. So that's why today all ships are not made out of wood; they're made out of metal. But it was hard to develop. So the North started making these Ironside ships. Sometimes they would just literally put iron on the outside of their ships, but they started making the ships that were totally made out of metal. The first one they made was the Merrimack, and that's the one that looks kind of like a flat top that has like a tent, like a triangle on the top if you see it. And the South had kind of this daring raid where they sent Confederate commandos into the Union port, and they stole the Merrimack. And the idea was that they were going to use the Merrimack to like sail out and blow up all the United States wooden ships so that they could lift the blockade that they knew was going to starve them out. But what they didn't know is that the Union had built a new, more advanced ship, the Monitor. And you see the Monitor is kind of the flat boat with the round circle on top. And that is actually a hydraulic turret. It could move 360 degrees like a modern ship. And in many ways, the United States Civil War is like the first modern war. Before this, you had Napoleonic Wars and things like that, but those were using old technology. The United States Civil War had factories making guns. They were rifles with bullets, not muskets with musket balls. It was an industrial war with railroads and all the things that had never been used in a war before, including metal gunboats with hydraulic turrets. Now, there was an epic battle between the Monitor and the Merrimack, and they both were shooting at each other, but because they both made of metal, the cannonballs were just bouncing off. And so it was a stalemate, and neither side won. And eventually, the South realized that their one Merrimack ship was not going to be able to break the blockade, so they just scuttled the ship. That was their one shot, the Monitor and the Merrimack, the first two metal ships in combat. All right, what's next? The Emancipation Proclamation. Now, even though the Union was losing almost every battle in the first 2 to 3 years of the war, the blockade was working. The South was running out of everything from food and medicine to bullets and guns. And the North looked at slavery. At the beginning of the war, they didn't see slavery as like the righteous thing that it was. Like, we're going to free the enslaved African Americans. They saw it as a way to undermine the South's economy. So the South saw black people as objects, and it was property. And so the North, under Lincoln, used the Emancipation Proclamation to free the slaves in the South because they were already hungry. There were not people working on the farms because many of the young men were off fighting, and they saw the Emancipation Proclamation as a way to take away the slaves and further hurt the South's economy, if that made sense. And Lincoln signs the Emancipation on January 1st, 1863, and it does not free all the slaves. It only frees the slaves in the Confederate States. So it's not a full emancipation. So states like Tennessee, West Virginia, Missouri, they still had slaves. So it wasn't a full, like, you know, let my people free kind of situation. It was a partial. It was a good thing, right? It's freeing people from slavery, but it's also kind of this economic tactic of the blockade starving them out. We're gonna take away the people that are working their farms. We're gonna do everything we can to ruin the South's economy. That was the deal. The South is going to try and invade the North. They try twice and fail. The North is going to try and destroy the South's economy until they just finally have to give up. It's not until the end of the war where Congress passes the 13th Amendment that bans slavery in America. But that's not till the end, the 13th Amendment. All right. Leaders of the war. The Civil War is a big war, and it goes on for 5 years. These are just kind of the basics. We have Ulysses S. Grant, who is the leader of the Union, but he's only the leader at the end. Like I said, Lincoln tries to get Robert E. Lee to lead the Union forces, but Robert E. Lee is more loyal to Virginia than he is to America, and so he turns him down. Remember, a lot of these guys knew each other from the Mexican-American War. Many of them went to West Point. They would have served together. And so when the Civil War breaks out, you have this idea of brother fighting against brother. And Grant doesn't even really join the army at the beginning of the Civil War. He's like a farmer, and then he works at a general store. But he later gets convinced by his good friend, General Sherman, to join the military. And while General Lee is beating up the Union's forces on the East Coast, General Grant starts out on the western theater of the war along the Mississippi. And that's where he makes a name for himself. I wish we were together in class so we could talk more about this, but he is the general fighting along the Mississippi River. He wants to take the town of Vicksburg, and once the North has the Mississippi River, then the South is really in trouble, right? Because they already lost the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean, and now the Mississippi River, they'd be completely surrounded. And it's General Grant who does that. And he gets this nickname, Unconditional Surrender, for U.S. Grant, because every time that he wins a battle, when the Southern general says, we want to negotiate terms of our surrender, he says, nope, unconditional surrender, or we keep on shooting. And that's what really brings Grant to Lincoln's attention, is this idea that he's a fighter. He's not like, he's not fancy. He's just going to keep on going at the army until he wins. And so in 1864, that's like the year before the end of the war, Lincoln makes Grant the commander of all Union forces. And as soon as he becomes commander, he just goes after Robert E. Lee. Now his second in command is a guy named William Tecumseh Sherman. I don't know if you will remember that at the beginning of the year, when we were talking about famous Native American chiefs, there was the Tecumseh, the famous Indian leader, who said that he would fight all white men who came on his land. Well, he was kind of so fierce that General Sherman's parents named him after him, so he becomes William Tecumseh Sherman. And Sherman is very good friends with Grant, but he's also his like right hand man. So when Grant is doing one thing, he always puts Sherman like on his flank, or protecting him. If he goes one way, he sends Sherman the other way to like pincer maneuver. And so they're good friends, and they're also the two best generals that the North has to offer. On the southern side, you got Robert E. Lee. There's a picture of him. He's clearly the best general in the Civil War by far. He always has fewer soldiers than the Union. He always has fewer supplies, but he's just like a better tactician. Think of him like Bill Belichick. He's always thinking 3 steps ahead. He's always winning no matter what. And he is the leader of the army of Northern Virginia. He has a kind of like Sherman to Grant. His right-hand man is a guy named General Stonewall Jackson. That's not his actual name. Stonewall was a nickname given to him because he was so brave and he would lead his troops so valiantly that it was said the enemy troops would bang up against his forces like a stone wall. And Stonewall Jackson is a great general. These guys are fighting for the South, so that is not awesome. But credit where credit's due, they are good at leading men into combat. Unfortunately for Jackson and for Lee, during the Second Battle of Manassas, also known as the Battle of Bull Run, he's shot by his own side. And that's how he dies. And, that is a big hit to the South. Not only do they lose the leader and his abilities and his, what he brings to the table, but also it's bad for morale. Not only did he die, but your own side shot him. And he is renowned for his, fervent Christian beliefs, aside from slavery, I guess. But he didn't drink, he didn't curse, he would always pray and read the Bible before he went into battle. But General Stonewall Jackson. All right. These are a couple important battles. Once again, the Civil War lasted from 1860 to 1865. It was fought all across the United States, and hundreds of thousands of people fought and died in this war. Your book kind of gives it 2 pages, but these are just some important battles that you'll need to know for your test. Number 1, the Battle of Vicksburg. General Grant leads the Union forces that defeat the South at Vicksburg, which is a major city on the Mississippi River. Now, once Grant took Vicksburg, the North now had complete control of the Mississippi River. And so it was at this point that the South was truly surrounded. They had the Union Army to the north. They had the Mississippi River that was blocked by the Union Navy to the west. They had the Atlantic Ocean blocked by the Navy to the east. And they had the Gulf of Mexico blocked by the Navy to the south. And so it was at this point that they really started to get hungry. I mean, they were in dire straits. You also have the Battle of Antietam. It was the single bloodiest day of the war. In fact, I think up until D-Day, it still might even be bloodier than D-Day. Tens of thousands of men died on one day on this battlefield in Antietam. A general later wrote that you could walk across the battlefield never touching the ground because you could just step on bodies. That's how many people died so close together. But it was a big deal. And the Civil War was the first photographed war. So not only was it bloody, but for the first time, in the Napoleonic Wars or the Crusades, nobody's getting pictures of decapitated bodies coming back home. But newspapers were sending photographers and reporters to these battlefields where they would take pictures of the bodies on the field, and it was a graphic thing. Then, kind of the most important battle is the Battle of Gettysburg. So, Lee and the South tried invading the North twice. The second time, they get all the way to Pennsylvania, and in Gettysburg, they fight the Union forces led by a guy named General Meade, and it lasts for 3 days. And the South had basically won every battle up until Gettysburg. After Gettysburg, they kind of start to lose every battle, and so it's seen as the turning point where the North finally starts to get the upper hand. And after Gettysburg, it's only a matter of time until the South wins. Then finally, it's not really a battle, but you have General Sherman's March to the Sea. So Grant, once he gets control of all of the army, he heads over to Virginia, and he's going to attack Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, because if he can take it, the war will be over. And he sends his number one guy to head out from the west. I think it's in Missouri, and he marches first to Atlanta. He takes the city of Atlanta, Georgia, and he burns it to the ground. And then he marches from Atlanta all the way to the ocean, and everywhere he goes, any farm he sees, he burns down. Any railroad line he sees, he tears it up. Any horses and pigs he sees, he captures them for the Union Army. Because remember, it's all part of the Union's plan to starve out the Confederacy. And so that's what the blockade is part of it. The Emancipation Proclamation, the burning the crops, all of it is to just ruin the South. Because once they ruin it, the South will have to give up. That's the idea. And sure enough, it works. The close of the war. You have Abraham Lincoln's famous speech, the Gettysburg Address. It lasts something around a couple minutes. And he's there after Gettysburg, the huge bloody battle. They bury many of the men on the battlefield, and Lincoln goes there to commemorate it. Today, you can go to Pennsylvania, to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and it has all of the tombstones of the men who fought and died there. And he gives this speech, and in the speech, he's basically saying why the Civil War is important. You know, like, the United States is a great idea, but for the first half of the United States history, they say all men are created equal, but they weren't. You know, there were slaves. People were bought and sold like furniture. And so the Civil War is important because it's making America become what it always was meant to be. And that's why the speech is so important, and that's why it resonates with people, to be perfectly honest. And when we go to Washington, D.C. next year, and we go to the Lincoln Memorial, they have inside of the building the whole speech carved into granite. And we're going to read it, and I can't wait. So, Lee is fighting Grant, and even though he's a better general than Grant, Grant is a bulldog, and he just keeps on attacking Lee. Doesn't matter if Lee wins, because he's got fewer men, Grant will just attack again and attack again and attack again, until finally Lee sees, the army is starving, they're running out of men, they're running out of everything, and he finally agrees to surrender to General Grant, and they meet at the city of Appomattox at the courthouse building, and General Lee surrenders to Grant. Now, Grant could have, Lee included, all the Confederate soldiers were guilty of treason, and the punishment for treason is hanging, it's death. But he not only allows the army to keep their weapons, but all they have to do is swear an oath to go home and become a United States citizen again. And that's what they do, and they all go home. And the Army of Northern Virginia disbands. Now, there will still be armies, Confederate armies, fighting Union armies for a few more weeks and months. But when Lee surrenders, that is the death knell for the South. And just as Lee surrenders, and Grant is victorious, it's at that same time that Abraham Lincoln is re-elected for his second term. And both Grant and Lincoln try to show the South that, yeah, this was a terrible thing, but we need to move forward and grow together. So Grant gives a very nice kind of easy peace terms, and Lincoln, in his second inaugural address basically says, like, we need to find a way to move on together. So that is the idea, that the United States is going to move forward a new, better version of itself. And the two main things it decides is, number one, the 13th Amendment, there will never be slavery in America again, no matter what. But number two, that the federal government is above state governments. So even today, doesn't matter what the governor of California says, if the president or if Congress says something, the governor must do it. And so Lincoln's second inaugural address, he tries to kind of not pour salt in the wound. He wants to try and make the South feel better, because obviously they're not happy about this whole thing. But who cares? Now, John Wilkes Booth is an actor. He was kind of a famous actor. And he's kind of crazy. And he shoots Lincoln in a theater. Lincoln had gone to go see a play with his wife, Mary Todd, and two of their friends. Now, John Wilkes Booth had a whole conspiracy to not only, Wilkes was going to kill Lincoln, but his friends, his confidants, were going to kill the other top members of the Northern government. So there was a guy who was going to kill the vice president, Andrew Johnson. There was a guy who was going to kill the Secretary of State, the Secretary of War, somebody who was going to kill Ulysses S. Grant. It was this whole plan. And the Secretary of State is actually stabbed up. I wish we had more time to talk about it, but he survives. The only person that is successful in killing their target is John Wilkes Booth. He shoots Lincoln in the back of the head. He jumps from the booth where Lincoln was sitting onto the stage, breaking his leg, and he raises his bloody dagger and his gun, and he says, "Sic semper tyrannis, thus always to tyrants," the same thing that the people who assassinated Julius Caesar said. And then he runs out and he escapes for 2 weeks, but they finally catch him and he dies. And they catch all of the people involved in this conspiracy, and they're all hanged. And it's kind of this last kind of ugly thing of the Civil War. But Lincoln's death is extremely important. I'm going to talk about it in a second. But first, this is a picture of Abraham Lincoln giving his second inaugural address there on the steps of the Capitol building. And if you look up top, you'll see a strange figure. Let's look a little closely, shall we? Who is that? None other than John Wilkes Booth. He was right there, allegedly, we don't know, during Lincoln's second address, and he kills him a couple days later. Now, following Lincoln's death, we have Reconstruction. Now, the word Reconstruction literally means trying to rebuild the South. For 5 years, the Union Army had burnt it to the ground. They had, torn up its railroad lines, burned the farms, and now the idea was they were going to rebuild the South, but also you had hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of African Americans who had just been freed from slavery, who had to live right next to the slave owners. And so Lincoln had sent federal troops to occupy the South and not only help rebuild the Southern economy, but also to protect the freed black community. Because they had been emancipated, they had been given the right to vote, but they had been enslaved for hundreds of years and they were at a disadvantage. Now, Lincoln had all these plans about how he was going to help integrate newly freed black people into society. And right after the Civil War, we see a number of African Americans who were elected into office. But when Lincoln is shot, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, becomes the president. And Andrew Johnson was not a great president. He was the first president to ever be impeached. He came from the South. He owned slaves in Tennessee before the Civil War. And when he becomes president, he starts to pull out many of the Union troops. And so instead of the South being rebuilt as a new country, instead the Confederate generals, the Confederate leaders, and the Confederate soldiers end up re-establishing this racist white government that enforces all of these laws that will become known as like Jim Crow laws. And from 1865 up until 1965, with Martin Luther King Jr., you will have a South that it still has, segregated schools and all of these things. So Reconstruction is seen as a failure because even though African American people were freed from slavery, they were still denied jobs, they were denied land, they were denied all of the things that you need to be a part of society. Who knows what would have happened to America if Lincoln had not been shot? If Lincoln had managed to serve another 4 years and reconstruct the South the way that he wanted, instead of how the slave-owning Andrew Johnson ended up doing it. We'll never know. But it's one of those pivotal moments in history that could have gone one way, but instead, one crazy man shoots Lincoln, and the whole thing goes another way. And I find things like that in history very interesting, and I hope you do too. Anyways, that's the end of the Civil War. We'll talk a little bit more, maybe Friday, maybe next week, about how the Civil War not only changed the South and slavery, but it also gives rise to the industrial age of America. We see trains and railroads and factories and steamships and all of these things that had gained so much energy in the Civil War. They take over. And so the late 19th century, you see the modern America coming up. Anyways, so that's a long thing today, but we had to get through it. I hope you guys are all doing well. Remember, if we go back to school before the end of the year, we're going to try and make that trip happen. I'll go in the summer. I don't care, whatever it takes. I hope you guys are doing well. Remember, wash your hands, stay safe, and I hope to see you again soon. All right, see you guys later. Bye.